Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art and culture, and I can see this week being a little messy. I had frankly more than I thought I would say about a fair number of albums here, so prepare for this to get a little bit complicated on the Pulse. So I've got 7 albums on the docket here, so let's start off with from Drearia, Bloodthirsty. I wish I could come here and say more about what this is, but former member of Alterity, known as Drearia, is back with some flagrantly vampire-inspired instrumental music, and I wish I could say I was even close to liking it. Putting aside my argument that if you're gonna go for vampire subject matter, it might make sense to indulge in consistently darker tones, or some ominous atmosphere building, or play off the dark contrast between Sinister Seducer and Outright Monster, what this is instead is a bombastic, rather oversold symphonic-tinged synth project that can barely capture a stable groove and really does not have any sense of subtlety whatsoever. It's clearly trying really damn hard to capture an epic sense of cool, but it's just like what I described in my Nightwish review a couple weeks ago. You need contrast, you need a sense of instrumental dynamics, and if you're making instrumental music, you should have a central melodic motif that sticks out amidst a half hour of synth-heavy preening. This should not be this forgettable. It doesn't help that for all the opulent choral vocals mashed against the blaring, filmy, and often tinny synths right at the front of the mix, it becomes so cloying to hear. Opulence, but with no foundation. And if I'm looking for a defining progression, and without a consistent low-end presence or well-modulated highs or any sense of strong melodic hooks, it just doesn't materialize consistently, which leads all these songs to run together. They might sound expensive and grand in patches, but if there's no root for me to latch onto, it's a lot of splash, but with no impact. I blame a lot of the overlayered excess of synths as a whole, which is always nearly placed on top of everything else and never have the body they should, and that's assuming that they carry more tone than texture, and that's pretty rare. But the underlying problem is a lack of restraint and sound compositional progressions. More often than not, just winds up kind of a mess, with some of the flattest horn pickups I've heard in recent memory. In other words, not good. Strong 4 out of 10. Not really recommended. Next up from Ghost Poet, I grow tired but dare not fall asleep.
There is nothing. Black hole mindset now, sinkhole gathering.
Okay, I've called out critic bait artists and albums before, but I think there's a subcategory to it. The acts that make respectable, tasteful, middle-of-the-road music that's just stepping a little out of pocket to gather some interest, but rarely more than that. These acts are normally very consistent, very professional, can ring together some very good albums, and often make an okay living. Hell, they're often a lot more marketable than their more experimental contemporaries, but their material rarely hits that spark of creativity that challenges or really sticks with people. Now, Ghost Poet to me falls a bit in this camp. A British artist at the intersection between Radiohead-esque electronic and alternative rock with a healthy dose of nervy trip-hop for increasingly melancholic and anxious projects. Now, I'd argue his albums are pretty good, especially when he pulls together some guest stars to contrast him, like on Some Say I So I Say Light in 2013, or Shedding Skin in 2015, but I've never quite been wowed by him. And with this, well, again, I don't really dislike it, but it doesn't really grip me as much as I would prefer. Part of this is that Ghost Poet doesn't have much in the way of interplay with anyone this time around, which makes for a dreary, brooding affair and makes it all the more solitary. But another thought is that this is the odd feel of a throwback. The smoky, husky vocals, the darker guitar and bass timbres, the splashes of keyboards and more tasteful strings, the push towards more abstraction. If this had dropped in the mid-90s, I reckon it would have had a lot more punch than it does now, mostly because there's not much experimentation. That's the other thing. When I go for brooding, meditative new music, I normally wind up in atmospheric black metal or ambient music where the texture is what sucks you in, or more thoughtful down-tempo hip-hop or country. Might be a generational gap here, at least for me. I can see a lot of people liking this. Now, for the most part, I can still appreciate the tones. Ghost Poet's vocals have enough subtle charisma to really pull you in, and outside of some very questionable synth touches, even without much in the way of strong hooks, the mix sounds really well balanced in a lot of the smolder, and this is where we go to the content. I have said for years now that Nihilism can get really boring for me, and having listened to all of Ghost Poet's albums, sadly kinda true across a lot of this. And while it can make the more relationship-focused songs have some complex intensity, and the female interplay on this train wreck of a life is essentially why that song works at all, and you know, I do appreciate some of the unstable political undercurrents that have carried over from his last album, but like always, the anti-social media stuff gets really exhausting, and I really wish I found more clever turns of phrase or transgressive punch in the writing beyond just a depressing wallow. I can't deny that, like with Nicholas Jar, this is a really unfortunate time to drop a project like this. But if I'm being brutally honest, outside of a few moments, even in better times, I'm not sure there's enough here to really pull me back. Strong 5 out of 10, just not for me, I think. It happens. Next up, from Boston Manor, Glue. I find it a little bit odd to say that my entry point for Boston Manor was actually seeing them live at Sonic Temple last year. I was roughly familiar with a couple of songs, but the first time the band really impressed me was their aggressive live performance and what seemed like some really strong hooks and delivery. And man, I wish the albums came even close to delivering that same level of intensity. Now, I'm absolutely a fan of the band getting darker and slower, a little nastier, and taking more stabs towards post-hardcore or even alternative rock or grunge on Welcome to the Neighborhood, but the more listens I gave it, the more the overproduction stood out in a really unflattering way. A lot of blurry atmospherics, keyboard touches, and vocal layering that didn't flatter the attempts at heavier darkness. But hey, I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, call it a more transitional moment. And yet Glue isn't so much a landing, so much as a faster amplification of many of the little frustrations I had with that last album. For one, the egregious overproduction of the guitars, the integration of drum machines, and some of the blown out mix has only gotten worse. It almost reminds me a little of the same sort of gummy power electronics touches that Code Orange uses on occasion, only flatter and clunkier and without the gravity or expansive mix to sound nearly as menacing as they're trying. In other words, like Code Orange's last album, especially when the drum mixing is so damn muddy across this project in comparison with some bass lines that actually had some real crunch. Which is a shame, because this album has some strong hooks and chugging bass lines, and Henry Cox is one hell of a frontman, which makes you think that the electronics are more of a feature or driven to emulate the similar gray, down-tuned dystopian rock, which if you look at the lyrics, that makes sense, but there's also a weird, self-consuming tension in the writing that kind of undercuts it. I get the moments of second-guessing and genuine angst and depression where they grapple with some of their own vices, especially how giving into that system can fly at cross purposes to any revolution that they might be striving for, but is probably easier. The late 90s throwback in Plasticine Dreams, great example of that. But as a whole, the Rage feels kind of directionless and unfocused, more about satiating some personal demons rather than attacking that monolithic system, which yes, can seem like the point at some spots, but when combined with the songs that are obviously speaking from the anti-revolutionary, fall-in-line POV, it just becomes a swirling morass that kind of undercuts itself and doesn't quite hold together. Ironically, the album might set out to test its glue, but paradoxically might succeed a little bit too well across the board, tearing itself apart. Shame the music kind of suffered as a result, so 6 out of 10, if you're curious. Next up, from American Aquarium, Lamentations.
It's all I can do most just to keep it between the lines.
Well, it's about time I got to this group at length. For those of you who don't know, American Aquarium is a long-running alternative country band, except at this point they're more the name of a rotating cast of bandmates around the singer-songwriter BJ Barham. They started breaking out in the late 2000s before nearly self-destructing, with the expectation 2012's Jason Isbell's produced Burn, Flicker, Die was going to be their last album, and yet it garnered them enough critical acclaim and popularity to keep on producing work to even more popular attention. And yet I would struggle to say they're among my favorites in indie country. country, mostly because of some broad inconsistencies across the board, and the band not really always playing to their strengths, both in the embrace of more elaborate studio arrangements, and writing that can go for some broad platitudes and just not hit as powerfully as it should, mostly because Barham's greatest strength is his confessional, unflinching self-awareness and honesty about his failures. I'm almost reminded a little of a proto-Rustin Kelly of the late 2000s work, but let's be real, Kelly would never make albums as uncomfortably detailed and questionable as 2008's post-breakup The Bible in the Bottle, or my personal favorite, 2009's Dances for the Lonely. And that's worth noting because this album, Lamentations, seems to be trying to hit both the politically charged anthemic moments and the more confessional patches. Very reminiscent of some of Jason Isbell's recent work, and expanding on territory from their last album, Things Change. Now, granted, they've done so by also trying to split the difference from the more straightforward, ramshackle country that's always been their strongest suit, and some slightly stiffer keyboard and synth-accented arranged bombast that doesn't quite hit as strongly or feel as well blended. So again, we got a project that's somewhat divided against itself. That being said, it is still pretty damn great. BJ Barham has been forced to grow up a little bit more over the decades, take responsibility beyond himself, and take the longer view. And he's still headstrong despite hitting rock bottom so often that, spanning personal demons to societal upheaval, he's just gonna keep on charging forward. And at least some raw moments like the reconciliation with a drunk driving incident on 6 Years Come September, or relationships that are mid-collapse on The Day I Learned to Lie to You, or How Wicked I Was, and those are great songs. And while the politics can feel a little bit scattered on the pro-marijuana song Brightleaf and Burley, it's trying to show weed as a way to rejuvenate American farms instead of opioids, and it only partially gets there, as well as the both sides of Me and Mine Lamentations. The deep cut A Better South, it's one of the most stridently anthemic and forward-thinking political cuts that Barham has ever made, and when this album actually leans into the richer country timbres of the pedal steel, the organ, the piano, and some of that smoldering guitar, it can be really damn infectious. Now again, I struggle to call this their best, but in terms of recording and writing, it's probably their strongest and arguably even most consistent since Burn, Flicker, Die. In other words, absolutely worth hearing. 8 out of 10, but while we're on the topic of great country, from Hot Country Nights, the K is silent.
It's that asphalt.
This is the sort of project that I almost want to say you should check out before I say more, but at the same time, the reason I had so much fun with this is because it's so obviously targeted to a very certain demographic and niche that just so happens to include me, but it's an extremely narrow niche. But let's not beat around the bush here. Hot Country Nights is a parody side project of Dierks Bentley, the veteran who's always had the ambition to say that he's going to make some flagrant career left turns, and then the balls to actually do it. People forget that right in the middle of his ascending popularity in the late 2000s, he decided to take a few years to make a bluegrass album that was way more credible than it had any right to be. Now, Hot Country Nights feels like it was made in that same sort of spirit. A parody homage to the late 80s, early 90s neo-traditional country scene by ramping up all the ridiculous tropes to 11. Now, there's an inherent risk to such a targeted parody, namely that there was plenty of goofy and stupid country songs from that era and sound too. And indeed, there are moments where the lines just get kind of blurry, and you just know that Brooks and Dunn, or the late Joe Diffie, or even Travis Tritt, who shows up on this album, they would have played them straight for blessed flat-out cornball fun. Now, of course, the way you get around this is the Weird Al Yankovic way, just sounding great enough that you don't really care, and that's where the album really shines. Unlike most parody albums, The K is Silent features some of the most note-perfect neo-traditional melodies, production from Dierks Bentley himself, and structure that I've heard in years, full of rich pedal steel, and fiddle, and saloon piano, and vocal harmonies, and the goofy key changes and outro breakdowns that might as well serve as extended piss takes by the band, but were welcome for it. And that's not to miss the more targeted parodies. The best probably being Then It Rained for a very particular Garth Brooks song, or how Hot Country Nights just take the veiled horniness of that era's more rambunctious songs and then moves it to the forefront, like on Asphalt and You Make It Hard with Terry Clark. Pair it all with the puns galore and the ability to lean into the broad silliness, and you wind up with some of the most fun I've had with an album all damn year. Where my only only real criticism is that some of the songs could have afforded to lean into the broader jokes a little harder, or just pack one more funny wordplay, especially around the moments that were George's macho posturing and butt references. I mean, there are some great jokes here, but the underrated master of this sort of subtle joke telling still is Brad Paisley, and this album doesn't quite reach the best of his level. But again, incredibly niche. I reckon that some of these jokes only work so well for me because this sound was that of my childhood. But Dierks Bentley likely made the best comedy album of 2020 with some damn great country to boot. One of his best albums in years. In other words, it's an 8 out of 10. You'll want to hear this. Next up from JoJo, Good to Know. Honest question, it's 2020, and outside of 2000s nostalgia, which is still odd to think about, why is anyone still checking for JoJo, especially as she's outright embracing the same sort of cooing, trap-inflected pop R&B that's so by the numbers across the industry right now? I covered one of her new singles in my song review series on IGTV, at Spectrum Pulse, Beat the Rush, and at best, forgettable. And spoilers, so is a lot of this album. Not even clocking a half hour, but really showing how JoJo continues to struggle to find a distinctive lane that can flatter her vocal tone. I said this about Mad Love, and it's just as true here. JoJo can sound really flat and pitchy without a lot of vocal control or a sense of subtlety, but that can work where she's allowed to belt or cut loose. A lot less so when she's stuck playing for a Summer Walker retread, where all the pitch correction not only makes her sound worse, but she just doesn't have the sort of enunciation or control or a sense of mood. And that would all assume that she's got production that can hold its own, but since she's now off Atlantic and thus doesn't have access to name brand producers, we're stuck with a lot of watery, tinny minimalism and off-key guitars, cheap-sounding percussion clicks, and really questionable overdubs and multi-tracking that are not really well supported by the rest of the mix, with a closing track bringing in a bunch of strings for an okay ending ballad. Now this would be where the content might step up, and it falls into two categories: the underwritten sex jams and some actually somewhat decent post-relationship tunes like Think About You and the album highlights Small Things. And when you know she can play into that melodrama, JoJo can get some decent moments. On the other hand, when she's stuck opposite Tory Lanez or making a hangover song that's as much of a headache, the results are a lot weaker. Really, the comparison that sprung most to mind is a lot of rejected Tinashe songs. A few okay moments, but not all that distinct or flavorful in pop R&B, and while parts of this album keep it above a failure, only barely. So, light 5 out of 10. And finally, from Car Seat Headrest, Making a Door Less Open. When I started hearing the singles and buzz for this project, what eventually coalesced in my mind were thoughts that I had after the last time I reviewed Father John Misty. Oh, Will Toledo is taking fame and success not particularly well, and he's making his panicked and less accessible Come Down release pretty early, the project that's designed to alienate everybody and make even the diehards uncomfortable. I've talked about this before, and how it can lead to some underappreciated greatness at its best, which this isn't. Look, I have given this around a dozen or so listens since its release, and let me stress, I get what Will Toledo was looking to do with this album. And again, this might be a case of him succeeding a bit too well, where the sound is intentionally trying to amplify the feverish discomfort and imposter syndrome that's surging through him as he struggles to maintain any sort of real connection with an ever larger audience, while seeing even if it's possible to fix some splinter relationships between friends and family, and even the larger world, which unsurprisingly, he's also self-sabotaging. And what's telling is that Will Toledo is also a bit more of a realist when it comes to getting away from his demons. Songs like Weightlifters basically highlight how even if you think you've got the momentum internally to chart your own course, you're still being shaped more than ever by the society and community and opinions of those around you. And that realization leads to some potent conflict. What will survive of his legacy and art in this torrent of warring motivation and self-destruction deconstruction, especially with heavier obligations now to his label and his audience. And then a rather inspired moment where Toledo just strips everything back to what's with you lately, sung by one of his bandmates as a moment to reassert a real connection, ask him those questions of himself. And in concept, I like the thematic core here. Will Toledo comes to cherish his better angels and realize how they will help fill in some of the emptiness within. And even when he goes home to confront some bad family relationships and actually comes up empty, there is an acceptance that coming with it, and the open question whether or not any of his realizations will hold true, especially as by this point, it's as much to the audience's support as it is for himself. The album ends with an open question, but all of it comes on a project that was built to alienate and disorient that audience, and while it was the point, it doesn't make this project any less of a headache to get through. I'm sorry, the synths are blaring, garish, and often off-key against a lot of blocky drums and drum machines, nearly all bringing a sickly, underweight feel that marginalizes the guitar, all to the point where you cling to whatever frail hooks you get in overlong, shuddering songs that can't help but feel underwritten, especially compared to what Car Seat Headrest has done in the past. More to the point, while Car Seat Headrest has always been somewhat meta, this is the first project that feels like an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. And when that can lead to some good observations, the framing can be a lot shakier. Many people have already highlighted Hollywood as the worst song here for sounding played out, obnoxious, and honestly kind of gross. But my issue is how it's an undercooked simplification of Will Toledo's relationship with fame. You would expect a more clever deconstruction, but that doesn't really happen. And while some of the details are actually different, that is true about a lot of the album. Car Seat Headrest is not the first act to make their emptiness of fame project full of alienation and sour electronics. Even mainstream pop stars do that. And a lot of the detailed and human storytelling of the band at their best, outside of isolated moments, it feels a bit diminished. So while this band did succeed in making the door a little less open, you know, they could have oiled the hinges instead of forcing that squeak. In other words, strong 5 out of 10, even the diehards might have some trouble with it. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know, a couple more controversial opinions. It wouldn't be this show without them, but hey, the comments, open down over there. If you guys want to actually hit that bell for notifications, I would appreciate that. And beyond that, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, as usual, middle of pandemic, so it's not the sort of thing a lot of people will want to do. But hey, if you want to, link to my Patreon right over there. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.